cannabis, corruption, and the Illinois General Assembly. We talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the weekly program about state politics and government and how it might just affect you. Joining me this week on Capitol View is Peter Hancock of Capitol News Illinois. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks.
Also, Sam Dunklau of NPR Illinois. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks, Bruce.
Great. First off, we'd like to wish everybody a happy Jesse White Day. We're taping here on Thursday, and today, December 12th, besides being Frank Sinatra's birthday, is now Jesse White Day in Illinois, as per a proclamation by Governor J.B. Pritzker. So, happy Jesse White Day, and happy day to Jesse White, Secretary of State. That said, let's move forward to some things that are on most folks' minds, at least, as we wrap up this year and look ahead to the upcoming legislative session. One thing that's going to be brand new in Illinois, starting January 1st, is legalization of marijuana for recreational purposes. Very big deal here in Illinois. And I gotta say, on a personal note, not just a personal note, on a professional note, I visited a dispensary for medical marijuana recently in downtown Springfield, 10 o'clock on a Wednesday. It hadn't just opened, it was just getting ready to open, and there were 12 people lined up outside waiting to get in. They all had medical marijuana cards, and I asked them, why the big crowd so early in the day? And they said, well, there's a shortage, and if we don't get here soon, then we might not get our cannabis. And that made me scratch my head a little bit. Why is there a shortage of cannabis, according to these folks I talked to, even as we're getting ready to legalize for recreational use? Not only did they tell me there was a shortage of marijuana, they also said it was extremely expensive. They said they were paying between $60 and $70 for 1/8 of an ounce of marijuana, which is extremely expensive compared to other states that have legalized. Peter, you've looked at this issue. Is this surprising? And if so, what explains it? Should we be concerned?
It is surprising because the way the bill was timed out, there was supposed to be enough lead time for cultivators to get product on the market in time for the January 1 rollout. So it is a little bit surprising. Probably have to talk to the Department of Agriculture or something to find out what the hiccup is there. I thought the interesting development this week was the other part, or another part of the marijuana bill, which calls for expungement of previous records for low-level crimes, possession of less than an ounce. And Cook County State's Attorney Kimberly Fox went into court and filed what appears to be the first motions to have about 1,000 records expunged. There may be upwards of 100,000 or more throughout the state, so we're going to be seeing this all over. It was really one of the more controversial parts of the bill. There were a lot of people who had concerns about just the wholesale erasure of history. And we don't yet know whether or not there are going to be federal consequences of that, because marijuana convictions can often disqualify you for military service, Coast Guard service, working in various federal agencies. So we'll see how that shakes out, but as of now, they're going forward with it.
Yeah, and also I think we should note, as I understand this, and correct me if I'm wrong, Peter, expungement is, of course, part of this social equity aspect of legalization, and it's aimed at not just erasing some of the wrongs of the war against drugs, but it's also designed to some extent, I think, perhaps, to give folks a leg up in entering the industry if they choose to do so.
Well, the idea, I guess, is that you shouldn't continue to pay a penalty for something that is no longer illegal. And the argument in favor of it, another argument in favor of it, was the fact that while marijuana use is pretty consistent across racial and demographic lines, people of color were infinitely more likely to be arrested, charged, convicted, even incarcerated for it than white people. So it really had a discriminatory effect, and so this is their way of going back and trying to correct what they see as wrongs of the past.
I think I've heard some Republicans say, but no two cases are alike in the criminal justice system. And so in some cases, I think the argument might be, or has been, rightly or wrongly, in that okay, you're initially charged with being a drug kingpin or some other offense, and walk me through how that works.
Well, a lot of these convictions, they were arguing, were the result of plea bargains. We'll plead you down to a minor offense if you roll over on somebody else or turn over evidence. They might not have pled down, the prosecutors might not have pled down to that lower level offense if they were pleading down to something that is basically not illegal anymore.
Sure.
That might have affected the calculus of those plea bargains.
If they had a crystal ball or could see into the future and saw that this would result in essentially nothing, they may have taken a different course?
Might have. Of course, like you said, every case is different. Hindsight is 20/20. But at some point, the advocates of this are saying, if this is no longer illegal, then because when you have that on your record, you put it on job applications. It follows you. It affects your ability to get student loans to go to college. It affects your ability to get a job. Sometimes your ability to rent an apartment. So it follows you around, and the feeling is that people shouldn't have to pay for the rest of their life for a minor crime that we're saying is no longer a crime.
Sure. There's another aspect of this, again, that I wrote about recently. So this was drug testing for marijuana for job applicants. And this is still going to be allowed in Illinois under the statute. Other states, notably Nevada, which has legalized recreational marijuana, have enacted measures saying, no, you can't do this anymore, with the exception of some jobs which are clearly linked to safety. We don't want airline pilots or what have you.
Truck drivers or railroad engineers.
Correct, and that's actually federally mandated, I think.
And that was a demand of the Illinois Chamber, really, was that employers should be able to maintain their drug-free employment policies.
And not face a legal challenge.
But let's be candid about this. Testing for marijuana is not particularly effective in ferreting out active users. Unlike other drugs, marijuana or the metabolites, it doesn't determine whether you were under the influence at the time the test was taken. It doesn't indicate anything other than you may have smoked marijuana or consumed marijuana sometime 30 days prior to the drug being consumed, as opposed to cocaine or heroin or methamphetamine, which are out of the system within 2 or 3 days. What's the fairness of testing people for marijuana use when there is such a disparity in the efficacy of the testing between marijuana and harder drugs?
Yeah, in terms of job applications, I'm not sure. I mean, if they're testing your hair, for example, I've heard that marijuana products will stay in your hair for a week or two at a time.
Right.
As far as DUIs go, I think there are other kinds of roadside sobriety tests where an officer can tell whether or not you're impaired by whatever source, whether it's alcohol or drugs or whatever.
I'm going to check you on that one. I'm not so sure that's true. The National Highway Transportation Safety Administration has yet to come up with a test that is foolproof, unlike the tests we've come to expect. Roadside sobriety test, the walk and turn.
Walk a straight line, turn
around.
Walk
a straight line.
Saliva has been proposed in some
states. That's been the one that folks are trying to, the law enforcement community is saying that saliva might show the most promise. But hair testing, for example, has been shown to perhaps discriminate against people of color. You're more likely to test positive if you're African American through hair than than if you're a Caucasian. Should we really be concerned? How much should we be concerned? Because nobody wants somebody who's not able to drive on the roadway, endangering all of us. Just recently here in Springfield, there's been an application filed for an on-site consumption at a marijuana shop in downtown Springfield, and the sheriff of Sangamon County has concerns about that. Folks imbibing and driving, so to speak. Are these scare stories? Is there? What sorts of things have been proposed or talked about in response to some of these concerns?
I think in large part we're just going to have to wait and see how these things shake out, and sometimes it might take a series of court challenges in order to develop a judicial record of how they're going to interpret these things.
Yeah.
It's just going to take a while to shake out.
It might help to say too, State Senator Toy Hutchinson, when she spoke with our publication these last couple of weeks, had said marijuana use, as Peter had mentioned earlier, is consistent among the demographic groups that use it.
Absolutely.
But the medical program has been out for a number of years, and in terms of folks abusing that program, let's say imbibing and driving after you've been using medical marijuana, according to her, the cases have been few and far between. So she anticipates, even though the recreational market will open the product up to potentially millions of more people, she expects it to remain still about as relatively low as it was in the medical marijuana community.
Sure.
Now, that's not to say that concerns of the law enforcement community aren't warranted, but perhaps the scare stories aren't as justified, shall we say.
People who want to do it have easy enough access to it through the black market, the illegal market, and one of the other, besides the social justice and equity issues, one of the other major arguments for this was to bring it out of the shadows so that we know what's being sold, we can control the purity of it, we can tax it, we can regulate it, because it's out there anyway.
Sure, and certainly that was a centerpiece in another state, that being Oregon, which legalized recreational use. And the argument in Oregon had been, we have this thriving black market, let's bring it out where everybody, it's no longer a crime and it's above board. And what happened in Oregon was it's led to a tremendous oversupply of cannabis that, according to very reports by various sources, including the Oregon State Police, that are considered to be very accurate. That marijuana is going somewhere. It's not all being sold in stores. And it's a lot different framework than what we have in Illinois. Oregon is much more laissez-faire.
And that's one of the reasons why Illinois lawmakers were careful to control the number of dispensaries that would be in each of the regions of the state, because they didn't want to go through what Oregon and California went through, where they said, let's let the market decide, and they pop up everywhere, and you end up with a lot of oversupply that then ends up getting dumped into the black market again.
Sure. And in the early years, next year, I believe, and certainly correct me if I'm wrong, the number of new dispensaries will be limited, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, to less than 100, I think more like 50 statewide, and by geographic location. For example, here in Sangamon County, from where we're broadcasting, there are currently 2 dispensaries. Each will be allowed to open a satellite location, and so that would be 4 plus 1 new one. And so that's a total of 5, and that's as many as are going to be allowed, I believe, through the year 2020, if not 2021. It's not going to be free for all.
Yeah, I've heard 30 will be open across the state come January 1, and slowly licenses will go. And I've heard, at least from our reporting that we've done, it is closer to 100 in terms of those will be open across the state. 75 is the agreed upon number so far.
Those that have medical marijuana permits were automatically allowed to apply early to get a recreational permit.
For a price.
For a price. But that was to roll the industry out, to get it going. But then other people, and there are things built into the law to make sure that the new licenses go preferentially to people from communities that have been disproportionately affected by the war on drugs.
It's a scoring system with so many points, and you get extra points if you can show that you're from a disproportionately impacted community or have been disproportionately impacted yourself. You get extra points.
You or your family.
If you or your family, if you have been convicted or served time for a cannabis offense, you get extra points. If you're a relative of somebody who has been arrested or convicted of a cannabis offense, you get extra points. And they do it by census tract, which, again, here in Springfield, it's led to an interesting result in one case, the village of Jerome, which, if you're from here, it's almost 90% white. It's got
a rather upscale suburban kind of residential area.
If Leave It to Beaver lived here, that's where he'd be. And it is now considered to be a disproportionately impacted area because it appears to be, was in a census tract with a large apartment complex that had been problematic for local police and for the housing authority, and that apartment complex is no longer there, but under the measurement taken by the state.
I'm not sure there actually is any retail zoned acreage in Jerome. I think it's
Well,
pretty much 100%.
is. Yeah, there is. But and let's be clear, it doesn't mean that you locate there.
Yeah.
You're from there, and that means you can get a license to do business anywhere within the boundaries of the state of Illinois.
And that is one of the things that I envisioned was that a large number of people, let's say from the south side of Chicago, may qualify for licenses.
Correct.
But they're going to put those stores up, on the North Shore where the college kids are.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think one thing that's interesting, well, I think there's a lot of things interesting in this law, which is about 600 pages long. You can get a state license to open a marijuana dispensary without saying where it is. You have, I believe, up to 1 year to find a location once you are licensed. And so it's an interesting law that at least I think is an interesting law. And it has not gone before the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules for review. No part of it has been reviewed by that. And that's for those of you at home that aren't as policy dweebs as we might be up here. The Joint Committee on Administrative Rules is a bipartisan group of legislators that is supposed to review laws, statutes passed by the legislature to enact rules for agencies to ensure that the intent of the legislature is carried out. I've talked to a couple folks about this. Some say no big deal, don't have to worry about it. Others say, well, wait a minute, the medical marijuana statute was reviewed by JCAR and rules were formed before the first marijuana was sold under the medical marijuana law. Is this something, given the complexity of the law, and this is a brand new one for every state that enacts it. No two are alike, but nobody has gone as far as Illinois has in terms particularly of the social equity aspect of this. How much of a thing might that be?
I don't know.
If at all?
I guess that depends on the amount of money that was involved in the medical cannabis law, as opposed to how much money you're looking at here with the recreational cannabis side.
Okay.
Remember, one of the primary reasons, granted, a lot sponsors and advocates and others will tell you it's about social equity, but another large component of this is that Illinois needs the tax revenue. So we're, in my mind, at least in my observations in talking with folks, we want to get this out as quickly as possible. We want people in stores buying marijuana products as soon as possible so that the tax revenue can begin flowing into the coffers.
Yeah.
And into cities and counties and townships as well.
For those that have allowed
Sure.
it. Yeah.
Well, let's be blunt. It's about drugs, and drugs have always been about money. And what we're talking about here, the estimates have ranged as high as $500 million a year in revenue for the state alone, from taxes and fees and whatnot. Now, when you consider the size of the state budget, $500 million is a lot for you and I, not so much in terms of the state budget. And some of it, I believe 20% is set aside for social equity programs to make up for. It's not all going
Grants
to go
to
in the general
community
fund.
organizations for neighborhood reinvestment and that sort of thing. One of the things I think is going to be interesting is everybody's looking at how much we can tax this stuff.
Yeah.
And there are studies that say if you tax it too much, and you basically make underground black market marijuana cheaper, people will go to the cheaper marijuana.
And as I said,
you can tax yourself out of business.
Fair point. I'll go back to the folks I talked to yesterday who were lined up outside the medical marijuana dispensary in downtown who I talked to. When they said they were spending $60 for 1/8 of an ounce, I asked them, well, how much does it cost on the street? And they said, $30 or $35, which begs the question, why are you here?
Yeah.
Well, I've spoken with folks who have participated in marijuana programs in other states, Colorado, Washington, and others, and while the temptation has been there since those laws have been enacted to go to the black market if the prices are too expensive, the thing that lures a lot of people away is the quality that you're getting on the street.
And that's what I was told.
Versus the quality that you're getting. Yeah. And not only that, the strict regulatory testing of that product to ensure that there's not additional additives in it that have, quite frankly, gotten people sick or even killed.
Yeah, and that goes back I'm showing my age here, the paraquat scares of the 1980s, where the U.S. government was alleged to have, and perhaps even did, spray fields of marijuana in Latin America and Mexico with deadly chemicals to kill the weed.
Kill the crop.
And so, geez, I don't want my crop to die, so I'm going to harvest quickly and get it for sale before that happens, which led to some concerns. The world isn't all about marijuana, in Springfield today, as much as we might wish it were. We still have an upcoming legislative session, and there was, to my mind, a fairly interesting bill introduced just today about a company that's on a lot of folks' mind, ComEd. Let's talk about that, Peter.
Well, during the session, the 2019 session, and this was one of Governor Pritzker's priorities, was the Clean Energy Jobs Act. And he announced this goal to move Illinois on a path to having 100% of its electric generation coming from non-carbon emitting sources. That includes nuclear energy. Mm-hmm. And so ComEd, as they have done in the past, came in because that'll have to be part of the package. And they have some aging nuclear facilities owned by their parent company that are in need of some help. Well, when you find out that the FBI is knocking on people's doors mm-hmm. and they're looking into the relationship between ComEd lobbyists and Speaker Mike Madigan's office, and gee, why is it that so many former staffers and people connected to the Speaker are getting very lucrative contracts to lobby for ComEd, and then ComEd gets whatever it wants in the legislature. Pretty soon, people didn't want to get anywhere near this thing, and I've had lawmakers.
It was radioactive, so to
tell
speak.
me it was toxic.
Yeah.
And,
to use a certain word.
And so, and right now, I talked to a legislator earlier this week, a Republican leader, who said, that whole thing is on life support until we find out where the prosecutors are going mm-hmm. With this ComEd thing. And so this week on Thursday, you had Republican Representative Matt Batnick, along with Democratic Representative Kelly Cassidy of Chicago, a conservative and a liberal, who have teamed up to say, to just pull the ComEd portion out of that bill, and just say, no more subsidies are going to ComEd.
And let's be clear, this is the equivalent of Donald Trump and Nancy Pelosi holding hands on a proposal and going forward.
Fair to say that they probably don't agree 100% on a pretty wide range of issues. But on this one, there seems it's pretty. I think it just goes to show you how toxic this whole thing is. And if the state is going to move forward on clean energy, you've just got to pull ComEd out of it until we see where the investigation's going.
And for context, when this bill was going through the General Assembly in 2016, the precedent was sort of already set that this was going to be a bipartisan piece of legislation. Mm-hmm. In one portion of the bill, you had the ComEd subsidies for the failing nuclear plants, but you also had green energy subsidies, mm-hmm. Which got folks like the Sierra Club and others behind the mm-hmm. legislation. And so Republicans and Democrats were able to come together on that. So it's, in my mind, not surprising that now on several years later, when those subsidies become problematic, that the two of them would come together and say, well, no more.
Well, Mike Madigan, the Speaker of the House, if he's not up to his neck in this investigation, a lot of folks think he is, or that's the perception. His inner circle has been questioned by the FBI. Subpoenas have been served, or search warrants by ComEd lobbyists. Mr. McLean is very close to the Speaker. He's fallen under suspicion. And so Mr. Madigan has spent not an insignificant amount on attorney's fees in recent years as this investigation has escalated. Long way wind of saying, would Kelly Cassidy have done this without checking with the Speaker first?
I don't know. I'm not that close with her. Mm-hmm. Part of me tends to think that she is of an independent mind. Yeah. And as are a lot of the young, new progressives within the caucus. As far as whether or not Madigan himself is in any trouble, I keep thinking, he's been the Speaker for most of the last 35 years.
34.
Okay. Which is most of 35.
Yeah, okay.
And if there was anything to get him on, surely they would have found it by now. Mm-hmm. And the other is, and several reporters were pointing this out on Twitter, is that everybody talks about how the FBI has been interviewing these people, but nobody reports about what did the people tell the FBI.
Right.
So we don't know what information. We know they're looking for information. We have no idea what information they're actually getting.
And let's also be clear, a lot of these raids, subpoenas were served a number of months ago. A lot of this isn't fresh. Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, and I've seen it written. The feds work in mysterious ways. We're not really sure entirely yet whether or not each of these federal investigations that we've been talking about on this program and others over the last several months are indeed connected. But it would be safe to say, in your estimation and others, that the speaker's watching his back.
Yeah. We're almost out of time so quickly. What's the best way to get a one-on-one interview with J.B. Pritzker these days?
I'm the wrong person to ask.
Well, apparently, according to the
do
Sun-Times political reporter Tina Svondalis, I hope I got that right, the best way is to show up to a press conference, because she's been the only one that shows up to press conferences where the governor is taking questions from anybody and everyone in the Chicago area, and oftentimes just one reporter shows up. Clearly, the state of the media is no secret. Some papers are in trouble. This surprised me. Should I have been surprised?
I was watching the live streaming of a bill signing that the governor did earlier this week, having to do with apprenticeships that are tied to the Capitol project. And he opened it up for questioning. And of course, the reporter is off mic, so it's hard to hear, but you can hear a little bit of it. And I said, well, gee, that sounds like Tina. And it just goes on and on and on. And I was like, well, I'm glad she asked those questions, because those were half the questions I had, and I haven't been able to get an interview.
She even had the photo evidence to prove it.
Yeah,
there she
by
is,
herself,
off in the corner, and the governor's folks were off to the other. That is to say, when the governor comes to Springfield, I should say, almost the entire press corps shows up.
Correct.
Not sure what the disconnect is in Chicago, frankly.
Fair enough. And with that, we're out of time. Thanks for joining us here on Capitol View, and we'll see you next week.